Water healed me. I want to see if this thing will too. He's like, okay, the only thing I'm asking is that you take more frequent blood tests because this has gotten pretty aggressive. I said, okay, I'll do that.
Welcome to the How I Healed It podcast. Here at How I Healed It, we get to hear stories from those who have healed their bodies from the unhealable through alternative methods and the experts who are passionate about whole body health and healing. As I have been on my own healing journey, I have found that the number one thing that has kept me going is learning from others who have gone before me. I believe we can gain nuggets of wisdom from each healing story that we hear. Thanks in advance for subscribing to our podcast so we can continue to bring these amazing stories. I'm your host, Plantfully Megan. Let's dive in. One thing I wanted to mention to you guys who are listening is I'm about to start offering extended interviews and other exclusive content to our How I Healed It community. So make sure to head over to howihealedit.com. That's howihealedit.com and sign up for our email list so you don't miss out on everything going on over here at How I Healed It. Happy healing out there, you guys. Now let's jump back into this awesome interview. Hey guys, it's Megan and welcome to the How I Healed It podcast. Today I get the honor of interviewing Dean Hall. Dean is a licensed clinical therapist and mindset coach with over 30 years of experience. He is a sought-after speaker and the author of the best-selling book, The Wild Cure, From Death to Life on Oregon's Longest River. Dean is also a 2-time cancer survivor who experienced radical remission from leukemia and lymphoma, and a 2-time world record-setting extreme distance swimmer. He is the first person in history to swim the entire 187-mile length of Oregon's longest river, the Willamette River, which he did as an active cancer patient in 2014. He also swam Ireland's longest river, the River Shannon, which is 180 miles in 2017. Dean, it's so great to have you on. I'm so excited to dive into your story. It is such a beautiful story of radical remission. And I read your book. It is phenomenal. I feel like every chapter I would put down, I would look over to my husband and be like, babe, you got to read this book. It's so good. So I highly recommend it. It is a book that really highlights just overcoming so much. And I think some of the hardest things that we can face in life, grief, loss, cancer, disease, and finding your mojo again and your joy in life. And you really did that. And it's so admirable. I think so many people can learn so much from you.
Oh, thanks, Megan. Yeah, it's really good to be on this side of that story. A lot of people will read it or ask me questions about it and act like, man, I just was a hero through the whole thing, or act like it was easy for me. And number one, I'm no hero. And number two, it wasn't easy. It never, a healing journey never is. I think by its very nature, it's not supposed to be. Because if it was, we wouldn't learn the lessons.
It's really, really good. I love that you said that, because I think in the middle of our healing journeys, I'm still on a healing journey from my own health things. And then those that are watching, from various things people are trying to heal and overcome, it doesn't feel glamorous oftentimes when you're in the middle of it. And so I love that you started it out with like, yeah, it's great to be on this side of it. Because on the front side, I'm sure every day was a mountain you were climbing.
It sure felt like it, or more like a big pit I was being swallowed up by that I just couldn't crawl out of. Yeah. My wife died 15 days before our 30th anniversary in 2010. And when that happened, the ironic thing is I was considered a grief expert in the Midwest.
Whoa.
And once she died, I realized that all I'd had was clinical book knowledge, but no real life knowledge.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it was so bad, and I felt like I knew so little that there was real life experience that was actually tangible and concrete and helpful, that I called up a couple of my old clients and apologized. I said, I thought I was helping, but now I know I wasn't. And they were really kind to me and pretty gracious. But yeah, it was just a real eye opener for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said that because going through grief is a completely different experience than what you think or how you think you would respond to it. I do not know what it is like to lose the love of your life.
Mhm.
I'm absolutely madly in love with my husband.
Oh,
So I
nice.
can barely imagine what that would feel like to lose him, especially after 30 years of marriage that you guys were so blessed to have together. But I know we've gone through 8 years of fertility struggles,
Oh,
and
wow.
that has been a grief journey
It
that
is.
I never knew. I never knew how much grief was in infertility and that journey, and it's taught me so much even about how to show up how to show up for people in grief. So I think it's so beautiful that you're like, I called back some of my clients. I was like, I'm sorry. I love that. Wow.
Yeah, my wife and I suffered from the same thing. Her mom had taken
Mm.
DES, a fertility drug, in the late 50s when she was born, and so
Oh,
it rendered her infertile. But we didn't know it at the
wow.
time, and so we had nearly 10 years of infertility stuff, and it was especially hard for us
Really?
because she was a kindergarten teacher, and at that time I was a sixth grade teacher, and we loved kids, and that's really all we wanted. And then to see my little sixth graders get pregnant as teens, it felt so unfair. And so I thought I knew some about grief, but it just wasn't the same as losing your partner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I can't imagine. I can't imagine how painful that was. And it was after that that you were diagnosed with cancer, correct?
Well, I got
She
leukemia
died
the
of
first
did she
time.
die of cancer?
Yeah, she died of brain cancer, and I was diagnosed the first time 3 years before with leukemia. But I got better after about a year, and my blood counts. The type of leukemia that I had, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, is not supposed to ever go in remission or go away at all. It's just supposed to become manageable. And it had become very manageable, and I was doing very well. And I thought I'd learned the lessons I'd needed to learn as far as taking care of myself a little more completely and a little more proficiently. But when she died, as is true with most cancer patients, they've found that a wide variety of cancers, particularly blood cancers, happen a year after a trauma. And mine came back almost exactly 1 year to the day after my wife died. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. And that's because of grief and the cascade of hormones that are happening in your body. Is that one of the theories of what that is?
Yeah, I believe there are two, and this is non research based, just anecdotal and from watching thousands and thousands of cancer patients. Two types of cancer, kind of the type that my wife had, where you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time and you get poisoned. Or type like I had, where it's just you're not really taking care of yourself. You're not The human body and mind were designed to feel and release. I tell everybody the emotional system works just like the digestive system. You chew up life's experiences, be they good or bad. That's exactly what you need in order to be strong, growing, healthy. But there are a lot of waste products. Those waste products are anger, sadness, fear, hurt, loneliness, guilt, shame, and they need to be released just like urine and feces. But we don't let them, especially men my generation. We were taught never to cry. And so you just clamp down, but that clamping down creates disease or disease. And I believe I was in such torment that I would have been surprised if I hadn't gotten sick. Never really cried before my wife died. And after she died, I couldn't talk about the weather. I couldn't say her name without crying. So I was just in abject grief. And that kind of heavy torment creates all sorts of problems, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really want to dive into that because I 100% agree. I think that our emotions and the things we experience, and then I don't know if it's that we're just not taught in our culture to express that well. I don't know if ancient cultures did that better with like coming together and wailing. I know in biblical times, they would rip their clothes and put ash on, and they would have this time of like real expression of grief.
Right.
And it's not something that's socially acceptable these days, is to
Right.
be in grief even for a week after a loved one passes. People are ready, like, okay, are you over it now? Okay, well, let's get you
Yeah.
out of this. Everybody wants it to be positive. I would love to hear some of the ways that you have found, and I know this is tied into your story, to express that grief and that loss and those hard emotions. How do you digest the hard things in life and release that and let that go?
Well, I don't think it's done in isolation. I think you have to have at least one or two, if not three, people that are close enough to you that will allow you to be raw and play the same song and dance over and over and over and over without getting too tired of it. I tell everybody that's going through something like this, try to find 5 people and then rotate them so you don't
Yeah.
wear anyone out. But it's not done in isolation. Thankfully, I was gifted with a couple really close friends, and then I've always been pretty close to my dad, and that really helped to be able to have other men that I could be especially painfully honest with. But for me, the grief really didn't turn until I found purpose and started getting much more connected. I think the reason that we all grieve so desperately and have so many diseases is because we are not connected with nature. I believe that we're also disconnected from nature, that nature is created to be, and they're finding now with science on grounding, Clint Ober's earthing, that we are filled with positive ions. The more we're charged electrically with those positive ions, the more actually, I wish they were called negative, because positive is really negative for your body and mind. And when we're out in nature, especially if we're barefooted, we discharge into the earth all those positive ions, and we pull up the earth's natural energy and electricity, which is negative ions, and that creates a release and a health and a well-being inside our minds and bodies. And so once I started swimming in rivers, practicing getting ready for the Willamette swim, that really started to soothe my grief. Number one, because I was face down and I was wet. And so if I cried and cried and cried while I was swimming, nobody really knew. But number two, there's something called the blue mind. It was discovered by Wallace J. Nichols. He's a marine biologist down in Southern California, wrote a best-selling book called Blue Mind. And he found that it doesn't matter your age, race, culture, gender. Within about 2 minutes of being in, on, around, or by water, your mind starts to relax and get into a flow state. Well, I was spending hours and hours and
Wow.
hours feeling the actual flow and kind of being rocked and moved by the river. I found
Wow.
slowed my brain down, let me release a lot of these feelings, let me start feeling comfortable in my body again. Because for 4 years,
Yeah.
I'd always been fit, I'd always been athletic, not super athletic, but loved to do athletic things. And I'd always felt very comfortable in my body. And all of a sudden, it was a very interesting experience to never be comfortable in your body. As soon as I'd wake up, I
Right.
call it the 1001 thud. I'd wake up and it'd be 1001, then thud. Oh, Mary's dead. And I called it my 5,000 pounds. And this 5,000 pounds just would sit on my chest every day, all day, no matter what I was doing. It was just always there. And it was just such torture. I'd never heard of Wim Hof or cold water immersion, but the Willamette is 40 degrees because it's largely a snowmelt river, so it's cold. And some people might say, oh,
Wow.
40 degrees sounds pretty warm. Not if you get in it.
It sounds water. If you're not from the West Coast and not used to cold lakes or ice cold ocean, and you've never experienced 40-degree water, it's completely different than 40 degrees outside. It is freezing cold.
Yeah.
And back to the point you made about grounding, isn't swimming in like a lake or a river, that's a whole grounding experience.
Yeah,
when you're it's like your whole body is grounding, from what I understand.
Yeah, electricity moves through water.
Yeah,
so your whole body's grounded. Then I didn't know anything about grounding. I was just doing this. I decided to do this because I'd helped many clients reclaim their life using Viktor Frankl's work and his pivotal book, Man's Search for Meaning. I knew that if you were passionate about a purpose, you could help come back to life. And so I searched for this purpose, and for weeks after weeks in prayer and meditation, asking God for a purpose, it was crickets. I mean, there was nothing. And then I came across a journal I'd been forced to keep when I was in 6th grade. And I thought, well, let's see what the 11-year-old dean had to say. So I opened it up, and it said, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And when I read it, it was just a shot of electricity went through me, and I'd forgotten the boy I'd been and the dreams I'd had. And I just knew that's what I had to do. But I'd known several men because both of my parents growing up here in Oregon were mountain climbers. Even my mom back in the 50s and 60s, when women weren't even supposed to leave home, she was out there climbing with the guys. That's
awesome.
He's just this tiny little Swede. And
I love it.
We all know she's stronger than any one of us. But so both my parents were climbers. So most of my childhood for me was very idyllic because I was just out there climbing. I climbed the tallest mountain in Oregon when I was 9 years old for the first time. I mean, it was just kind of something I inherited from my parents. And so to get in this water and ground, that was, and get in cold water. When I did that for the first time, January 4th of 2014, I knew I had to in order to start preparing my body, because I was an active cancer patient. I thought, man, if I don't start preparing my body, then I'm going to be in trouble. It'll be too much of a shock. So I got in my first ice bath, and this was 10 years before it was even a thing. I mean, I wasn't on Instagram. Nobody was doing ice baths.
Yeah.
And I got in.
What year is this? 2013 or something?
Yeah, it's January of 2014. I wasn't even on Instagram.
Yeah, it was not. Yeah, it wasn't a thing.
And I'd never heard of Wim Hof.
Not like it is today.
Right. Got in, and I got out, and I thought, something's different. And I'd only been in for 2 minutes. And it was not even 40. It was probably about 45, 46, but still cold. Got out, and I thought, something's different. Then I realized, oh my gosh, the 5,000 pounds is gone. How did that happen? And so my therapist brain's whirring around thinking, okay, did I do cognitive behavioral? Did I go into a meditative state? Did I hit a flow state? None of that seemed true. I thought it had to be a neurological knee-jerk reaction. So I waited, and 2 or 3 hours went by, still no 5,000 pounds. Finally, after about 4 or 5, the thud hit, and so I got back in the ice bath. I thought, let's test this thing to see if that's actually what it was. So I got back in the ice bath. Boom, gone again. And I didn't use it, and don't encourage people to use it as a way to ignore your grief or try to find a quick, easy pass around. But Megan, it was so comforting to know that if I was in abject misery and I needed a little bit of relief, it was there, and it was there immediately without a pill or a potion or any kind of routine that I had to do. I didn't have to journal or think or do cognitive behavioral therapy or all that stuff. All I had to do is just get my carcass into an ice bath.
One thing I wanted to mention to you guys who are listening is I'm about to start offering extended interviews and other exclusive content to our How I Healed It community. So make sure to head over to howihealedit.com. That's howihealedit.com and sign up for our email list so you don't miss out on everything going on over here at How I Healed It. Happy healing out there, you guys. Now let's jump back into this awesome interview. Wow, that's amazing. And the picture that you painted in the book leading up to that moment of starting to swim and get in the water was you were really sick. You were not, you were really, really sick. Scarily right. So it sounded like.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd lost my will to live. And when your mind and spirit are broken, the body follows. And I was down to 159 pounds, and I'm 6'1.5". Typically, I run right around 10 to maybe 12% body fat. Right now, I'm probably at about 11 or 12, and I weigh 212. And so if you can imagine 60 pounds lighter, I was skeletal. I mean, you could see every rib, you could see my pelvis bone. It was, I've always told everybody I've never been a pretty boy, but I was ugly with a capital Ugg. It was not a pretty sight.
Well, and when you're that underweight, that's going to take a toll on your hormones and your emotions. Oh, yeah. Like there's it all plays into one another, and that being that underweight doesn't make it easier to decide, hey, I'm going to go swim. And so you were jumping in that water and starting to train with the idea that you're going to swim some river or you're going to swim the English Channel is kind of your thought at that point.
August 13th of 2013. That was the first day I got in a pool. And my original idea was to become the first active cancer patient to swim across the English Channel. And right. The English Channel is about 20 miles, give or take, depending on how you hit the currents and stuff and where you swim. And so I thought, there's no way, I'm so sick, there's no way I could probably do 20 laps, but I can do 20 lengths. And most people know a length is half a lap. And so that's what I did. Typically, 10 laps would take me about 7 or 8 minutes. It took me an hour to do that day. I would swim one length and be so exhausted, I'd just hang on the pool and breathe for a while, then swim back. And then in typical fashion, the way my dad trained me, because my dad was a beast, he climbed every mountain on the West Coast, many of them scores of times. I think he climbed Mount Hood 40 or 50 times. He's run almost all the world's major marathons, including the Boston, the London, the New York. So this guy was a tiger. And one of the things you always have us do, his children, is he'd push us to our limit. And then he'd say, okay, do one more. And so I got to 10, and it took me an hour. But then I heard him saying, do one more. So I did one more. So I ended up doing 11. And then every day, I would try to do one more lap. And what I didn't put in the book, the ugly part of that, it was wonderful because for the first time, I felt like myself again when I was in the water, because I'd done a lot of triathlons and done hundreds and hundreds of miles of laps over my life. And so lap swimming seemed comfortable and something I recognized. But the horrible thing of it was I had lymphoma and I had it bad. And I didn't know anything about the lymph system. You'd think if you had lymphoma, you'd learn about the lymph system, but I hadn't because I'd been in such misery I didn't even want to read. But the lymph system, they're like little filters in your blood vessels that only work when you move. And when you have something like lymphoma, they swell up with toxins. Well, every time I would swim, within about 15 to 30 minutes, I'd get flu-like symptoms afterwards that would last a couple hours or so. And so that was one of the hardest parts of preparing for the swim. Everybody's like, oh, you decided to swim, you practiced, and then you got in the river and swam 187 miles. I can't tell you how many times somebody's raised their hand and says, wasn't that fun? Have
you're
you
like,
ever
no.
swum 10
You're
miles
like,
in one day? Have you ever had cancer? Have you ever been really cold even for an hour, much less for 10? No. It's fun. It was a
like
fun
you go do it.
Yeah. It was a fun
You go do it healthy and
Yeah.
let me know how you feel.
what I've learned to tell people, because, and this kind of got rid of it, I said, okay, think about 187 miles. Think about something 187 miles away and get that town in your mind. Everybody got it? Yeah. Okay, now think about driving there. How long would it take? Oh, about 2.5, 3 hours. Okay. Now think about how long it would take if you rode a bike. Oh, maybe a day or two. Now think about how long it would take and how hard it would be if you ran that far. Oh, well, now think about how hard it would be if you walked that far. Oh, it'd take probably about a week. Well, now think about how hard it would be if you crawled while somebody's spraying cold water in your face. You're like, oh, now think about if you did that while you had the flu. And then they're like,
Wow.
well, that doesn't
And
sound
while you're wrestling currents and while you're wrestling barges and figuring out the everything.
right.
That
Right.
and doing it not on a paved road where nobody's ever done it before.
Right. Right.
That's wild.
And I
That
thought it would
is
become
so
a thing,
incredible.
Megan. I thought once I did it, everybody would be like, oh, I can beat that old man. Still to this day, 10 years later, no one's done it. So, because I think it's kind of overwhelming to think about.
Yeah, it's a lot. 187 miles is a lot of miles. You have so many good quotes in your book. I have a few of them here. One of them is by Albert Einstein that I really loved. There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle.
Yeah, that saved my life. That came before the inspiration to do the swim. I was praying, and because I had gotten to the point where I didn't care if I lived anymore. And my daughter was a senior in high school. My wife, Mary, her mom, died her senior year, October of her senior year. And now she's 21. She's still doing well in college. I don't know how. I was always amazed at how she was able to even go to school and get good grades. But I started entertaining the thought, I've accomplished just about everything I ever wanted to accomplish. I fell in love. I had a good marriage. We raised Bree, and that was quite a love story and an interesting thing that happened after years of infertility, like we talked about. And she was a wonderful girl. I'd written a book. I'd developed a speaking career. I'd been a teacher for 20 years. By that time, I'd been a therapist for another 20. I felt like I'd helped a lot of people. and made some impact, at least at times, I'd had a good life. And so I was ready to go. And then I realized that would make my daughter an orphan at 21. That's entirely selfish. And so I knew I had to have a purpose. I knew I had to have something to hold on to. And because of my faith, it had usually been a scripture or something. And man, nothing. And then one day I opened up my laptop, and on the Yahoo homepage was that quote. And I was in such a bad place. I hate to admit this. Probably you can see how I'm not a hero when I tell you this story. I saw this quote, and even though I'm not prone to having a filthy mouth, every cuss word in the world came out. And then I even started putting them together in strings. I cussed poor old Albert Einstein out, called him all sorts of nasty things. You frizzy-haired old German physicist, blankety blank blank. You have no idea how I feel. And I slammed my laptop shut almost so hard in such anger that I almost broke the screen. And I'm like, what am I doing? Because I've never been a real angry person either. And it's what I call a Velcro quote. It just hung with me. And then after 2 days, I'm like, wait a minute. I've been praying for something. Maybe this is it. Come on. And so I thought, it seems so preposterous, but two things are absolutely true. One, Albert Einstein's probably a little smarter than I am. And two, what would happen if I at least tried it for 2 weeks? So I decided to give it a 2-week trial run. And within 2 days, things had started to shift so dramatically that I knew I was going to make a commitment to it for the rest of my life. And it is a commitment because it's so opposite of cultural training.
Of viewing everything as a miracle?
Yeah. Even silly little annoying things like the guy in front of you is texting and making you miss the light. How is that a miracle? The only thing at first that was really hard to comprehend is how could my wife dying be a miracle? Well, I couldn't get there, so I would just pass it with maybe it was a miracle in the making, which we know it was. It created, out of that kind of catastrophe, was the creation of miraculous events. I would never have swam the Willamette if my wife hadn't died. Yeah, I wouldn't have then been put in a position to be in cold water for 22 days, almost 10 to 12 hours a day, and been given the gift of healing my leukemia without chemo or radiation.
Which is so phenomenal. And I would love to touch on that. So you're swimming, you keep building up your stamina, you get in the river. Your dad, who sounds like an awesome man, he's kayaking by you to be your safety and your guide on the river. And this is part of your process of mentally and emotionally finding your purpose, resetting, letting go of the grief, or just grieving, just actually feeling the grief and moving it out of your body. And what happens in your body as you're swimming? What is happening while you're doing this? What is this experience like, and how is the miracle of healing happening?
Yeah. Unbeknownst to me at the time, but now we know science proves this, when you are in a hypothermic state, your immunities are just boosted exponentially because they think they need to fight off the cold. It changes the way your mitochondria cluster and then perform. It draws from brown fat, which is super healing for the body. Of course, I was moving my lymph system practically 24 hours a day, it felt like. Plus, I was weightless and in a flow state constantly. So that's giving me the sense of blue mind. And they've now found that being in that flow state or being in and around water is really helpful, almost becoming the treatment of choice for PTSD. I didn't know that at the time.
Wow. Wow.
And then also, there were it took down inflammation, and I was terribly inflamed because of all the lymph nodes that were so swollen. So it's just doing all sorts of things. Plus, you get what's called cold water euphoria, and I had that pretty much the whole 22 days, because when you get in a hypothermic state, you get huge dumps of oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, all these feel-good hormones and chemicals. So just tons of things scientifically were happening in my body. But for me, more than that, just having something to think about and concentrate on every day other than what I lost, life all of a sudden became very simple. For that 22 days, all I had to do, Megan, is get up, eat, get to the river, put on my swim stuff, get in, and swim for 45 minutes to an hour until I got to get out, or I went hypothermic, because I'd started going hypothermic about every 45 minutes. I'd have to go, get this, you swim for 45 minutes, and you're so cold that they call it deep core throttle. You can feel your internal organs banging against your ribs. And it's a real deep shiver. And so when that would start to happen, I'd get out and I'd do jumping jacks and run in place for 10 or 15 minutes, eat a little bit, and then get back in and do it for another 45. So my rest times were actually running in place, trying to warm up. So it was something. Yeah.
That is phenomenal. I've done cold plunges, but I've never experienced that. You know, cold plunge for like 2 minutes, not 45 minutes in 40 degree. Yeah. Right. My husband will do the really, really cold pools. Like we have a cold plunge. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, he sealed off a freezer and plugs it in, and he likes it in the like high 30s, and he'll get in there and he'll be in there for 5 or 10 minutes. And this is inspiring me to do more of this, but unless it's in the upper 40s or low 50s, I won't even get in it because it's so cold. And to even stay in for a minute or just to get your armpits in, once your armpits are in, that is just like the most painful part, to like open your arms. And I mean, you're swimming like this. Oh my gosh. Like that is, I've never even heard of that deep core throttle. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's called thrombosis, but we called it deep core throttle. Yeah. And for me, the place that hurt the most was my face, having my face in and just feeling my eyes and nose freeze. You have to keep it in for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then finally it goes numb. But then it's weird to try to talk afterwards because your face is kind of frozen.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Wow. And so how many hours were you swimming every day as you were, once you'd started the Willamette? What was your schedule like? What did it look like for you to swim every day?
Well,
and were you staying in towns as you went?
Yeah, we were luckily sponsored by a hotel chain that so we try to be in and swimming by 8 or 9 o'clock a.m. And then we usually try to get out by 5 or 6 p.m. But I was swimming that entire time unless I was trying to warm up. And so I was averaging 10 to 12 miles a day most days. And then we took every Sunday off.
Wow. What was your mindset like at that time to get yourself in that water? I just think about the level of excellence and just that extreme sport mentality of being able to pull something like that off. It's really admirable. How do you cultivate that type of mindset to be able to do that?
Well, the funny thing is, the reason the Willamette dream came back is I'd come out here for a bicycle race in 1984. I was 24 years old, and I did pretty well. I came in the top 20, and there were like 500. And so we threw a big family picnic party celebrating, and it was on the banks of the Willamette. And the Willamette during the 60s and 70s growing up was so polluted, it was just gross. And I'd been away to Kansas in college and courting my cute little Kansas farm girl for what, 8 years by then, 6 years, and hadn't seen it really get clean. And so when we were on the banks of the Willamette and it was beautiful and blue and clear and clean and there were waterfowl all over it, I was just amazed. And so I stood on the banks, and maybe it was the ego of a young man having just done well in a bike race. I don't know. But I looked at my dad and I said, hey, has anybody ever swam this whole thing? And he was like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Where do you come up with this crazy crap? And him saying that startled me because I expected him to think it was a really cool idea. But then it kind of was, it sunk the hook deep. I'm like, okay, now I got to do it, prove the old man wrong. And so I was planning on doing it, but it just didn't seem feasible at that time when we were trying to buy a house. And what 24-year-old can take, at least back then, take 3 weeks off from work. And so I let that dream just kind of go into hibernation. And when it came back at 54, I realized now, because I was 54 when I swam it, there's no way I could have probably done it at 24. I probably would have broken. I wasn't prepared. But having lost Mary and then almost died, from the time Mary died to the time I swam the Willamette, I woke up in the hospital 3 different times, and the doctors looking at me and saying, whoa, you almost didn't make it. We called your family.
Wow.
And then going through oncology work and sitting in an oncology ward and with a bunch of people that just looked like zombies, and going through everything I went through prepared me to have the kind of mindset I needed to face that kind of hardship. Because no matter how hard it got, I thought, I'm alive. I'm strong enough to do this. I'm not dying in a hospital bed. I'm not at my wife's funeral. I'm not in an oncology ward wondering if I'm going to be alive tomorrow. This is okay. Yeah, I'm tired, but my mantra was, if I want what no one has, I have to be willing to do what no one does. And no one had done this. So I've got to be, there's a reason no one had done it. It's hard.
One of the quotes in your book fits really well with what you just said. You said, the bigger the dream you have, and the more impossible it seems, the less people you have who want to support you at first. Not only that, but everyone tries to talk you out of it. Nobody is encouraging. You feel totally alone. You constantly wonder if it's worth it, and it's agonizing.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't have the guts to tell my parents. And you got to remember, my parents I saw as the great adventurers, they were both tough. And I waited for about 10 days to 2 weeks before I went and had dinner with them and told them what I was going to do. And they'd seen, what the last 3 years had been like for me. And they'd seen me, they'd gotten the calls from the doctors. And I thought they'd just be so proud of me. I thought they'd be so excited. And Dad was stunned. He's like, well, I don't know what to say. And my mom started crying. And I'm like, Mom, why are you crying? She's like, oh, I'm just so worried. It just sounds crazy. And why don't you wait till remission? And so I realized right then and there, if the great adventurers aren't behind it, I better not tell anyone else. And so I didn't for about 3 months until this was August of 2013. And then in December, that's when I decided to swim the Willamette and change from the channel to the Willamette. And then early of 2014, I was in the middle of what I call the desert of big dreams, that agony where I was still feeling pretty sick. Nobody seemed to care. Everybody was trying to talk me out of it. And I thought, I gotta do something. So I believe that if you really want to do something big, you've got to make it impossible to back out. And so I started a Facebook blog, a daily blog where I told people what I was doing, when I was going to do it, and then how many laps I was going to swim the next day. And very quickly, I had about 500 people reading this thing every day. And most of them I knew back from Kansas, where I'd lived for 30 years. And to me, knowing that they knew and knowing that I've never been much of a bragger, if I'm going to say, if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And my word means a lot to me. And so I made it impossible for me to back out. And I think when you hit that desert of big dreams, you've got to make it impossible. My mantra at that time was the extraordinary becomes possible when you make it impossible to remain ordinary. So everything I did, I was trying to make it impossible for me to remain ordinary. Yeah.
Wow, that is so good. I love that. That's such a powerful thing that you said. You have to make it inevitable, you have to make it impossible not to do it. And whatever that looks like, for each person it might look different. I love what you did. That would have done it for me, is putting it out there publicly and saying, hey, I'm going to do this. And then it's embarrassing not to do it. So you got to actually pull it off. Right. And now you've pulled off a world record that nobody else has even tried to touch, which is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal world record. And what I love, because what you see with extraordinary overcomers is this ability to keep going back, even through failure, even through hardship. And that was one of the things that you did, because at the beginning, the first time that you tried to get in the river, it was so cold and you didn't have a wetsuit on. You thought you failed. You were like, well, I made it inevitable that I have to do this. I can't back out. And the first day in the river, it's already over. What was that like for you?
Horrible. It was terrible. I've always been pretty strong-willed. People who love me call it stubborn. If I set my mind to something, like when I was a little kid at 9 climbing Mount Hood, I do it. And that's why I was good at triathlons and endurance events, is I can crawl back there and outlast just about anybody. And so I thought with the cold, it would probably be mind over matter. And I'd been, spending time in ice baths for 5 or 10 minutes. Well, anyway, I got in the Willamette. That day it was 39 degrees in the water. And that's at the boat ramp where it's not moving. When it's moving and going past your body, it's colder. And the reason I was trying to do it without a wetsuit is because the International Organization of Open Water Swimmers won't count it as a valid swim if you wear a wetsuit. And the Guinness Book of World Records follows them. They wouldn't count it as a Guinness World Record if I wore a wetsuit. And so I was going to try not to wear this wetsuit. I lasted for about 22 minutes. And then I had what's called hypothermic aspiration. It's where your body gets so cold that your lungs seize up and start spasming. And it feels like you're throwing up, only you're throwing up air. It's the weirdest feeling ever. It freaked me out. And my whole body would kind of spasm and seize up. And all the air would go out of me. And when it do that, my body would sink and I wouldn't have any air. And I'd get back up to the surface, gasp a couple times, and think, okay, forget it. Just keep going. Start again. Boom! It happened again. After about 5 or 6 of those, I stopped, and Dad was in front of me, and I'm like, I think we're going to have to call it for the day. And he's like, what? And I'm like, I'm seizing up. I'm spasming because of the cold. And he's like, well, let's get you out. And so I went over to where my cousin was in a canoe. And when he pulled me in the canoe, he called me Papa Smurf. I was just blue. I had gotten so cold. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought, all these people, this was about this time. It was in April when I did this. And it was about an hour and a half drive home. And it was real quiet in the truck with Dad. And I'm doing everything I can not to just scream or, get too emotional. And we're not talking. And finally he's like, what's going on? And I said, I don't think I can do it. You saw what happened. I don't know what I'm going to do. And he looked at me like I was some stupid kid. And he's like, get a wetsuit. And I'm like, oh, that hadn't occurred to me. And so we went back the very next week. I found a wetsuit sponsor. I got a wetsuit. We went back either the next week or the week after. We went back very quickly, did the same swim. It was about a temperature or a degree or two warmer, not much. And I did it with ease. So it's just always finding a way. Not long after, I saw a quote by Yvon Kennard, the guy who started Patagonia Sportswear. And I think this is one of my favorite quotes ever. He says, it's not an adventure till something goes wrong. And I think to accomplish any big goal or adventure, you got to be ready for things to go wrong and you overcome them.
Yeah, that is so good. And that you hear that a lot with excellence training is you keep you learn from those things that go wrong. Failure is success. Celebrate the failures and expect the failures. And I don't think that's wasn't something I grew up with. I know it's not the mindset most people have. When you fail, you think, oh, I should turn back. But actually, failure is inevitable. And so enjoy it. And if you're willing to fail the most and willing to do the hardest thing over and over again, those are the people who succeed. And that is what you did, which is so phenomenal. I want to kind of skip forward to you accomplished this huge thing, which you guys, you got to read the story. Just go buy his book, The Wild Cure. It is so phenomenal. So you make it, you do this thing. You swim 187 miles, overcoming all odds. And then how is your body feeling now? Like you have done, how long did it take? What's going on in your body? How are you feeling now that you've swam for weeks and weeks on end? And then what does your oncologist have to say about it? Because at this time, did you have both lymphoma and leukemia?
Yeah. And I had gotten so bad that my dad also has chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and it's not supposed to be hereditary. And so the doctors were stunned. They're like, it's not supposed to be genetic, and you both have the same kind of leukemia. This is odd. And he was almost at death's door in the early 2000s, and he found one of the world's leading researchers and oncologists down at University of California, San Diego, Dr. Juanario Castro. Just this sweethearted little Cuban guy. I just love him. And my parents were so worried about me, they started flying me down there. And so I was going to see him, and we thought that this would be such a test on my body that I'd end up much worse rather than much better. And so we had a round of chemo and radiation set for as soon as my swim got done. But really, after about the first week or two, my body kind of adjusted and got used to this. Because a marathon in Ironman triathlon world is 3 miles. And so I'm doing 3 to 5 marathons a day. And my body just accommodated it as the human body does. And I started feeling better. And I was having fun, and I was doing this thing with my dad and my mom, and we were all just so close and enjoying it that after I got done and I just looked back in a journal, I thought I'd gone to see the oncologist in August or September, but I put it off because I felt so good, Megan. I didn't want any bad news. And from the time I went to the oncologist with my wife, every time I'd ever gone was bad news. And so I put it off. And I didn't go back to see my oncologist when Ariel Castro flew down to San Diego till January of 2015. And he came in and he said, "Dean, I don't know what to tell you." And I'm like, oh. Because anytime I'd heard those words, it was life-threatening. That's exactly what the oncologist had said with Mary. That's exactly what he'd said with me. I don't know what to tell you. You're probably not going to live long. So he's like, I don't know what to tell you. And he's like, oh, sorry. I realize now what that must have sounded like. No, what I'm saying is I don't know what to tell you. Your leukemia is totally gone. I don't know how it happened. It must have been something to do with the swim. He's like, in 30 years, because he was considered one of the world's leading researchers, he said, in 30 years, I've never seen that happen. If I hadn't diagnosed you myself, I would have thought you'd been misdiagnosed. He said, but that's the good news. The bad news is your lymphoma's got much, much worse. It's gotten very aggressive. And I said, I thought so because my lymph nodes are even larger. And he said, we've got to find a way to do something. He said, I'm going to schedule chemo and radiation for it here in a month. I said, okay. But in my mind, I thought, nature healed me once. I'm going to start looking on the internet, see if I can find credible research that will help me see if nature can heal my lymphoma. And so I went home.
That made me, that I feel the tears welling up in my eyes. That is so powerful. Nature healed me once. Let's see if there's anything that can heal me again. That's so cool.
And within a week, I found a Japanese researcher, Dr. King Lee, who from Nippon University, found that if you go and spend an hour or two in a big forest or around big trees, that there's something emitted, an essential oil that's imperceptible that you breathe in called phytoncides that boost your immune system for over 2 weeks by 300 times. They boost what's called the NK or natural killer cells.
You guys, did you know that this podcast today would not be possible if it were not for essential oils? The company Young Living Essential Oils is what is making this podcast possible right now. I have actually been to the Young Living farms and have seen their more than organic farming practices firsthand. This company is legit the real deal. They are also the only essential oils I will use in my home, and you guys know I won't recommend something unless it's something I actually use in my house. And I've been using these oils for years. If you want the benefit of the outdoors in your home like Dean is talking about here, go grab a diffuser and some pine essential oil or some evergreen essence by using the link in my show notes so we can continue to bring you these amazing interviews. All right, let's dive back in.
This essential oil called phytoncides that boost your NK cells for by 300 times for 2 weeks. And so I thought, and the research was really good on it. And so I thought, I'm no nuclear scientist, but if it boosts by 300 times for 2 weeks, if I go out every week, it'll become exponential. So I called up Dr. Castro and I said, hey, Doc, I'm going to go ahead and try. And he's like, not another experiment. And I'm like, yeah, I wanted to, the water healed me. I want to see if this thing will too. It's like, okay, the only thing I'm asking is that you take more frequent blood tests because this has gotten pretty aggressive. I said, okay, I'll do that. And so I did. I'd go in every 2 weeks for a blood test. I thought that was fair. And I started going out every Thursday night, staying all night deep in the forest, off the trail, way away from any kind of campground in an old growth forest with 100-foot Douglas fir trees, and staying in my backpacking hammock and just reading and sleeping and praying. And I did a lot of crying. I'd wake up at 1 just crying. Well, nobody was around. And so I felt comfortable to just let it drain, just let it go. So I'd cry for an hour or two, fall back to sleep, and wake up rested for the first time in years. And then I was only about a quarter of a mile from a river that came out of Mount Hood's glacier. And so it had all sorts of glacial minerals, and it was super cold. And so about anywhere around noon to 1, I'd get in it. I'd pack everything up and go and do a cold plunge in that glacial stream and then come home. And I started that May of 2015, and by March of 2016, my lymphoma was gone.
Wow. That is so phenomenal. You said you did it once a week?
Once a week, yeah. And the research says you only need to do it an hour or two, but I was fighting for my life. So I decided to do it almost 24 hours, every Thursday night and Friday. And to this day, I thought I'd quit after I got in remission. Or originally, I thought I'd quit when, it started snowing really badly. But then I just got some snowshoes and geared up and got a 45 below bag and all that kind of stuff because it was so much fun to just be out there every week. And to this day, Megan, it's what I do every Friday. I go out early and stay late. And it is the best reset and stress reducer and mind clearer than anything I've ever found. So I'll do it the rest of my life. Yeah.
Wow, that's so inspiring. My husband and I love to camp, but I've never done snow camping. My brother, we live in the Sierras, and he'll go out on the weekends and he'll do all kinds of camping. So I'm like, oh, wow. And he says what a great reset it is for him mentally and emotionally. And so to hear you even describing, even scientifically, what's happening in your body and your mind and your soul, it's so cool. It's so admirable and so beautiful. And we really have got so disconnected from nature in our modern day and age. And there is something so healing about being out amongst the trees. And we are natural tribal beings, and I think we're dying to return to that. And when we do, then we find life. And it's so cool. I read in the book Radical Remission too what happens. There was a story of, I think it was a Japanese man. He had lung cancer, and it was really, really bad. They basically were sending him home to die. And he would go out in the mornings, and he really, really early in the mornings, because I think he'd read something about the oxygen. And oh no, actually, I think he was the one who discovered it. He went out and he would notice that the birds would start singing 43 minutes before the sun rose and it was always like on the dot, 43 minutes before the sun rose every single time. And he was like, what? He got curious. What is signaling the birds to start singing? The sun is changing when it's coming up all the time. So how do they know right when? And what happens, he discovered, he did some experiments, is the trees actually begin to let out tons of oxygen really early in the morning. And it's so healing for your body. And that was one of the therapies he used, was going out at 5 in the morning, just waiting and being there right as the trees are emitting all the oxygen and hearing the birds sing and taking deep breaths and breathing that in. So even as you're saying that, of just what, the essential oil that's being released into the air and the grounding that's happening, being amongst the trees, and the peace and the solitude and the being able to express yourself and your emotions freely. And then also the oxygen that you're just breathing in, just reoxygenating your body. It's a healing bath, and it's free, aside from a sleeping bag or your hammock. It's a really inexpensive therapy. It's so beautiful.
So organic. And, in this age of digital deluge, most of my work is like this. Now it's remote. And so I need a mental reset. And the things that were happening, I didn't know about earthing or grounding back then, but that was happening. I didn't know about the birds till only about 3 months ago. I read that when we hear bird song, it puts our mind in a rest state, because our ancestors, anytime the birds sang, they knew there weren't predators around. So it signals safety to you. So there's a whole scientific study around that. And then when you're in a place that's natural and you're seeing maybe even hundreds of different shades of green, it signals safety and comfort to your mind and body. And then if you're by a stream, you're getting blue mind. We are hardwired for nature. And I think the reason we're all so anxious, depressed, addicted, and sick is because we live in these concrete jungles and sit in front of fake scenes, or even experiencing fake experiences. We watch movies and YouTube, and we've become spectators rather than experiencers.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, I think, why, if you're addicted to screens, which it's an easy addiction these days, and it's one that people are talking about more and more. But if you can just take 3 days or a week, just turn them all off and watch what happens in your spirit. You just reset, anxiety goes away. It's one of the most healing things. It's so very important. And then to get out in nature, it's so important. What you said about the green is so true too. I remember my dad used to live in another country, and it was all desert. So I would go, I went and I would stay with them for the summer sometimes. And I went and stayed one summer, and I remember coming home for college, and it'd been 3 months of all I saw was tan. Like everything was tan. It was sand everywhere. And I remember I was flying into Virginia actually. And I started crying when I saw the trees. And I had no grid for an experience like that, but I saw the color green, and it was like my body was hungry for green. It was like I was eating it up, and I got instantly emotional and started crying at 19 years old because I hadn't seen it in 3 months. And so I think there's so much to be said of, we are hardwired for nature. We are hardwired for color. We're hardwired for nature, and to get out as much as we can in it is so healing. That is so amazing. And so how you are now, how is 10 years cancer free almost?
Yeah, 8 years, right? And feel better than I've ever felt. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Congratulations. That is so awesome. Okay, if you had 30 seconds, the curtains are closing, to say anything about your story and encouragement to those who are listening, what would you say?
Find a passionate purpose and give yourself fully to it. Instead of fight cancer or any illness, love life. And the way you make that switch is to aim smaller. Target shooters say aim small, miss small. Well, fighting cancer, you're trying not to die. And you're going to die anyway at some point. That's too big of a thing to fight. you don't really know how to fight death because you're going to lose at some point. So aim small by giving yourself something to passionately concentrate or focus on. I might not have been able to swim the Willamette, but I was willing to die trying. And it gave me something achievable. I was never going to achieve not dying. And so much of fighting cancer is not recovering from cancer as much as it is trying not to die. And that's too big. So aim smaller and give it your whole heart. Really just try to love life for all it's worth, is what I would encourage people to do, because that's what worked for me. And then get out of your house and away from your phone and experience nature however it's comfortable for you.
Yeah. So good. I absolutely love that. That's so good. I know the listeners have loved your amazing story. It's probably one of the most inspiring stories on our podcast. I love your story.
Thank you.
If they wanted to connect with you and wanted to know how they could work with you, what do you offer and how do they find you?
Sure. I'm more involved on Instagram than I'd like to admit. But I made it even a spiritual promise or discipline that I hoped to get a number of followers. And I promised myself that if I ever did, I wouldn't be one of those schlocks that don't answer people. So if you DM me, I answer you. And so they can get a hold of me through my Instagram at Dean Hall Official, and I'll answer them. And then they can go to my website. It's called thewildcureway.com. And I do personal coaching. I take people on personal retreats. I'm doing a couple one-day retreats with me on the iconic Cannon Beach this summer, where you come the night before, we have a little bit of a meeting, and then we spend all day on the beach, and I teach you how to connect with grounding, earth, and then cold water, and then the wind. And then we're going to make a fire at the end, and I'll teach you how to use fire, because there's a lot of studies about how the shimmers and the glimmers that happen in fire are really good for your brain. And so I teach people how to use the 4 elements in a really fun day. I'll even teach in the grounding point, I'll draw a big labyrinth and have everybody walk a labyrinth, which is an ancient form of meditation and grounding. And so those are coming up, one in June and one in August. And then I'm running a men's retreat that I'm really excited about up in the Olympic National Forest in July. And we're only going to let 10 men come because it's immersive. And I've partnered with a guy who's a cold plunge trainer and a near Michelin chef. And he was rated number 3 in ultra racing, running. He's just this little wiry guy that's super fast. I just love him. His name's Nick. And I'm partnering with him. He's going to take care of the food and some of that. And then I'm going to teach men how to connect with nature and themselves to become healthier, happier, more confident men with their wives and with their families.
Wow, that's so amazing. Oh my gosh. I need to come hang out with you. All those things are so cool. I know.
Yeah. Well, for couples, I'm going to offer a 2-for-1. So if you want to bring your husband.
Oh, cool. That's good to know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, heck yeah. I've wondered that about fire. Like I said, we love to camp. Mm-hmm. And every time we go camping and I'm just sitting by the fire looking at the fire, I've thought to myself so many times, like, there's got to be something to this, because it's just so relaxing.
One of the things I've found as an outdoor therapist is, especially with men, you get men around the fire and all of a sudden they relax and they open up and start telling you their stories. Yeah. Guys, you can walk them 20 miles and they barely grunt, but you get them around a fire and they start talking. So I think there's something we still that's just hardwired in us because our ancestors sat around fires, for all the generations before us. It's just hardwired into us that we'll find out in science here in the next 10 or 20 years.
And they shared stories. And
Right.
and really I think it's really not been that long. We've only been in front of screens and had technology and electricity not that long. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of years of our heritage had nothing to do with what modern day life looks like within the last 50 to 100 years, which is so wild.
Less than 100 years. Yeah, my parents didn't grow up with TVs until they were almost graduated from high school. So, yeah.
Yeah, so crazy. Well, it was so great having you on,
This
and
was
thanks so
fun.
much
Thank
to
you.
those who are listening. It's been so much fun. I've really loved this whole talk. It's so inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
For those of you who are listening, if you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more healing stories and expert interviews, please be sure to follow along and subscribe to our channel and send this to somebody who you know it would be inspiring to. It could be life-changing. It could change the trajectory of somebody's life. I know that Dean's story is changing people's lives, and people's lives are being saved because of it. It shifts the perspective. It's a pattern interrupt, and it's a message that needs to be heard by every modern day person, especially those who are fighting for their health and their life and their joy. And so make sure to send it to someone that you love. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.